The small town of Willowbrook was known for its quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and uneventful days. But on a chilly November morning, everything changed. The police station was bustling with its usual routine when the doors burst open, and a young girl, no older than 10, stumbled inside. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes torn, and her face streaked with tears. She looked around frantically, her eyes wide with fear, and then she spoke words that sent a shockwave through the room. "My mother has not died," she gasped, her voice trembling but clear. "He just killed her." The officers froze. Detective Laura Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving the toughest cases, was the first to react. She knelt down to the girl's level, her voice calm but urgent. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emily," the girl whispered, clutching a stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. "Emily, can you tell me what happened?" "Who killed your mother?" Laura asked, her mind racing. The town hadn't seen a murder in over a decade, and the idea of a child witnessing such a crime was unthinkable. Emily's lower lip quivered. "It was him, my stepfather. He made it look like she died, but I saw him. I saw what he did." The room fell silent. Laura exchanged a glance with her partner, Detective Mark Reynolds. They both knew this was no ordinary case. If Emily was telling the truth, they were dealing with a killer who had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. But why would a man kill his wife and stage her death? And how had a young girl uncovered the truth? "Where is your mother now, Emily?" Laura asked gently. "In the ground," Emily replied, her voice breaking. "He buried her in the woods behind our house. He said she was sick, but she wasn't. She was fine. He lied." Laura's heart ached for the girl, but her detective instincts kicked in. "Emily, can you take us to where he buried her?" Emily nodded, her small hand gripping Laura's tightly. As they prepared to leave, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Why had Emily waited so long to come forward? What had she seen that made her so sure her stepfather was a killer? And most importantly, what other secrets were buried in the woods behind that house? The detectives and Emily climbed into a patrol car, the tension palpable. As they drove toward the house, Laura couldn't help but wonder, what would they find when they got there? And what would happen if Emily's stepfather discovered they were onto him? The story had only just begun, but already the questions were piling up. Who was this man Emily called her stepfather? What had driven him to commit such a heinous act? And how would a young girl's courage unravel a web of lies that had been carefully woven to deceive an entire town? The drive to Emily's house was tense and quiet. Emily sat in the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes fixed on the passing trees. Detective Laura Hayes kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, her mind racing with questions. How had this little girl endured such a traumatic experience? And why had no one noticed anything wrong before now? As they pulled up to the house, Laura's first impression was how ordinary it looked. A modest two-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn and flower pots by the front door. It was the kind of house that blended into the neighborhood, the kind of house where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Emily pointed to the backyard. "The woods are back there," she said softly. "That's where he put her." Laura and Mark exchanged a look. They needed to proceed carefully. If Emily's stepfather was inside, they couldn't risk alerting him. Laura crouched down to Emily's level. "Emily, does your stepfather know you came to the police?" Emily shook her head. "Number. He thinks I'm at school. He doesn't know I saw what he did." Laura nodded, relief washing over her. At least they had the element of surprise. "Okay, sweetheart, stay close to us, okay? We're going to check the woods first." The three of them made their way to the backyard, where a dense line of trees marked the beginning of the woods. Emily led them to a narrow path, her small hand trembling in Laura's. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the trees blocking out the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. After a few minutes, Emily stopped abruptly. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a patch of disturbed soil. "This is where he buried her." Laura's stomach churned. The ground looked freshly turned, and there were no signs of a proper burial. No headstone, no flowers, nothing. Just dirt and leaves. She turned to Mark. "We need to call this in. Get a team out here to excavate." Mark nodded, already pulling out his phone. As he stepped away to make the call, Laura knelt beside Emily. "Emily, you're being so brave. Can you tell me more about what happened? Why do you think your stepfather did this?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "He was always angry. He yelled at her a lot. And then one night I heard them fighting. He said she was going to ruin everything. The next morning he told me she was sick and had to go away. But I saw him. I saw him carrying her out to the woods. She wasn't moving." Laura's heart ached for the girl. "Did you tell anyone? A teacher? A friend?" Emily shook her head. "I was scared. He said if I told anyone, he'd do the same to me." Laura clenched her fists, her anger simmering beneath the surface. This man had not only taken a life but had terrorized a child into silence. She was determined to bring him to justice. As they waited for the forensic team to arrive, Laura's mind raced with questions. What had Emily's mother known or done that made her stepfather feel she would ruin everything? Was this a crime of passion, or was there something more calculated at play? And what other secrets were hidden in this seemingly ordinary house? The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. The forensic team arrived, along with additional officers to secure the area. As they began to dig, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something much bigger than a single murder. The woods held secrets, and Emily's courage was the key to unlocking them. But as the first shovelful of dirt was removed, a chilling thought crossed Laura's mind. What if Emily's stepfather wasn't acting alone? What if there were others involved in this twisted scheme? And what would happen if they realized the truth was about to come to light? The forensic team worked meticulously, their tools carefully removing layers of soil from the disturbed patch of ground. Detective Laura Hayes stood nearby, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the excavation site. Emily sat on a fallen log a few feet away, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She looked small and fragile, but her eyes were filled with a quiet determination. Mark approached Laura, his voice low. "We've got officers stationed around the house. If the stepfather shows up, we'll be ready." Laura nodded, her mind racing. "We need to find something concrete. If this turns out to be a dead end, we'll lose any chance of building a case against him." As if on cue, one of the forensic technicians called out, "Detective Hayes, you need to see this." Laura hurried over, her heart pounding. The technician pointed to a piece of fabric sticking out of the dirt. It was stained and dirty, but unmistakably part of a woman's dress. Laura's stomach churned as she realized what this meant. Emily had been telling the truth. "Keep digging," Laura ordered, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The team worked quickly, and soon they uncovered more. A shoe, a handbag, and finally the body of a woman. She was pale and lifeless, her face frozen in an expression of fear. Laura recognized her from the photos Emily had shown them earlier. It was her mother, Sarah. Laura turned to Emily, who was now standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with horror. "Emily, sweetheart, you don't have to look," Laura said gently, stepping in front of the girl to block her view. But Emily shook her head. "I need to see," she whispered. "I need to know she's really gone." Laura hesitated, then nodded. She knelt beside Emily, holding her hand as the girl looked at her mother's lifeless body. Tears streamed down Emily's face, but she didn't cry out. She just stood there, silent and stoic, as if she had already accepted the truth. "We're going to make this right, Emily," Laura promised. "We're going to find out why this happened and make sure he pays for what he did." Emily nodded, her grip tightening on Laura's hand. "He has a box," she said suddenly, "in his office. He keeps it locked. I saw him put things in it after he hurt her." Laura's eyes narrowed. "What kind of things?" "Papers. Photos. I don't know what they are, but he said they were important. He said if anyone found them, we'd all be in trouble." Laura exchanged a glance with Mark. This was the break they needed. If the stepfather had been hiding evidence, it could be the key to unraveling the entire case. "We need to get a search warrant for that box," Laura said. "And we need to bring him in for questioning. Now." Mark nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. As he stepped away, Laura turned back to Emily. "You've been so brave, Emily, but I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that?" Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I want him to go away. I don't want him to hurt anyone else." Laura's heart ached for the girl. She was just a child, but she had already seen and endured more than anyone should have to. Laura was determined to make sure Emily's courage wasn't in vain. As the forensic team continued their work, Laura's mind raced with questions. What was in the box Emily had mentioned? What secrets had Sarah known that made her a threat to her husband? And how deep did this conspiracy go? The sound of approaching footsteps broke Laura's thoughts. She turned to see Mark hurrying toward her, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "The stepfather's car is gone. He's not at the house and no one knows where he is." Laura's heart sank. If he had fled, it would make their job much harder. But there was no time to waste. "Put out an APB on his car," she ordered. "And let's get that search warrant. We need to find that box before he does." As the team sprang into action, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The stepfather was out there somewhere, and if he realized the police were onto him, there was no telling what he might do. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the race to uncover the truth had become a race against time. The search warrant arrived within hours, and Detective Laura Hayes wasted no time. With Emily by her side, she led a team of officers into the house. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emily pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "That's his office," she whispered. "The box is in there." Laura nodded, her heart pounding. She motioned for the officers to follow her, and they entered the room. It was a small, cluttered space filled with papers, books, and a large desk. On top of the desk sat a locked metal box, just as Emily had described. "That's it," Emily said, her voice trembling. "He always kept it locked. I never saw what was inside." Laura approached the box cautiously. It was sturdy, with a heavy lock that would require a bolt cutter to open. She turned to one of the officers. "Get me the tools. We need to open this now." As the officer left to retrieve the tools, Laura knelt beside Emily. "You've been so brave, Emily. Whatever's in this box, it's going to help us find the truth. But I need you to be ready for anything. Can you do that?" Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I just want him to go away. I don't want him to hurt anyone else." Laura squeezed Emily's hand. "We're going to make sure of that." The officer returned with the bolt cutter, and Laura stepped aside to let him work. The sound of metal snapping echoed through the room as the lock gave way. Laura took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside, she found a stack of papers, photographs, and a small USB drive. Her hands trembled as she picked up the first document. It was a bank statement showing large sums of money being transferred to an offshore account. The name on the account was unfamiliar, but the amounts were staggering. "What is this?" Mark muttered, picking up another document. It was a contract signed by Emily's stepfather and another man whose name Laura didn't recognize. The terms were vague, but the implications were clear. This was some kind of illegal deal. Laura's mind raced. Was Emily's stepfather involved in something bigger than they had imagined? Was Sarah's murder connected to this? She picked up the USB drive and handed it to Mark. "We need to see what's on this, now." Mark plugged the drive into his laptop and they waited as the files loaded. What they found was even more shocking than the documents. The drive contained photos of Sarah, photos that looked like they had been taken without her knowledge. There were also audio recordings, emails, and financial records that pointed to a web of corruption and deceit. "This isn't just a murder case," Laura said, her voice low. "This is something much bigger. He was using Sarah to get information. She must have found out something she wasn't supposed to know." Emily's eyes widened. "Is that why he killed her?" Laura nodded, her heart breaking for the girl. "It looks that way, sweetheart. But we're going to make sure he pays for what he did." As they continued to sift through the contents of the box, Laura's phone buzzed. It was a message from the station. "We've got a lead on the stepfather's car," Mark said, reading over her shoulder. "He was spotted heading out of town." Laura's jaw tightened. "We need to find him before he disappears. If he's running, it means he knows we're onto him." She turned to Emily. "Emily, I need you to stay with one of the officers while we handle this. You've been so brave, but this next part might be dangerous." Emily nodded, though her eyes were filled with fear. "Please be careful," she whispered. Laura gave her a reassuring smile. "We will. And we're going to make this right." As they left the house, Laura's mind was racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was the man in the contract? What had Sarah discovered that made her a threat? And how deep did this conspiracy go? The hunt for Emily's stepfather was on, and Laura knew they were running out of time. If they didn't find him soon, the truth might disappear with him. The police had tracked Emily's stepfather, Robert Carter, to a remote cabin deep in the woods, about an hour outside of Willowbrook. The cabin belonged to an old friend of his, someone who had no idea about the crimes Robert was accused of. As Detective Laura Hayes and her team approached the location, the tension was palpable. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Laura turned to Mark, who was driving. "We need to be careful. If he knows we're coming, he might try to run, or worse." Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We've got officers surrounding the area. He's not getting away." As they pulled up to the cabin, Laura's heart raced. The place looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch. But the fresh tire tracks in the dirt told a different story. Robert was here. Laura stepped out of the car, her hand resting on her holster. "Robert Carter," she called out, her voice firm. "This is the police. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and Robert stepped out. He looked disheveled, his hair unkempt and his clothes wrinkled. But his eyes were sharp, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "We want answers," Laura replied, stepping closer. "We know what you did to Sarah. We know you killed her and tried to cover it up. But it's over, Robert. We have the evidence." Robert's face paled, but he didn't respond. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder as if considering making a run for it. "Don't even think about it," Mark warned, stepping forward. "You're not going anywhere." Laura took another step closer. "Emily told us everything, Robert. She saw what you did. She knows the truth, and now so do we." At the mention of Emily's name, Robert's expression changed. For a moment he looked almost guilty. But then his face hardened, and he shook his head. "You don't understand. You don't know what she was going to do. She was going to ruin everything." "What are you talking about?" Laura demanded. "What was Sarah going to ruin?" Robert hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But with the police surrounding him, he knew there was no way out. Finally, he let out a long breath and slumped against the doorframe. "She found out about the money," he said quietly. "The offshore accounts, the deals. She was going to expose everything. I couldn't let that happen. I had no choice." Laura's stomach churned. "So you killed her? Your own wife?" Robert's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "Here," he said, handing it to Laura. "This is everything. The accounts, the names, the deals. It's all there." Laura took the paper, her hands trembling. She unfolded it and saw a list of names and numbers, bank accounts, transactions, and what looked like coded messages. It was a goldmine of information, but it didn't excuse what Robert had done. "You're under arrest," Laura said, her voice cold, "for the murder of Sarah Carter and any other crimes you've committed." As the officers moved in to handcuff Robert, Laura's mind was racing. The case was far from over. The list Robert had given them pointed to a much larger conspiracy, one that went beyond Willowbrook. Who were the other people involved? And how deep did this go? But for now, the immediate threat was over. Robert was in custody, and Emily was safe. As they led him to the police car, Laura couldn't help but think about the little girl who had been so brave, so determined to see justice done. "We'll make sure he pays for what he did," Laura said to Mark as they watched the car drive away. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work to do." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, but at least we've got a starting point." As they headed back to the station, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and she was determined to find it, no matter what it took. Back at the police station, Detective Laura Hayes and her team worked tirelessly to decode the list Robert Carter had handed over. The names, numbers, and coded messages pointed to a network of illegal activities, money laundering, fraud, and even ties to organized crime. It was a sprawling web of deceit, and Sarah Carter had somehow stumbled into the middle of it. Laura sat at her desk, staring at the evidence spread out in front of her. "This goes way beyond Robert," she said to Mark, who was leaning over her shoulder. "These people, they're powerful. If we're going to take them down, we need to be careful." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "We've got to follow the money. If we can trace these accounts, we might be able to find out who's behind all of this." As they worked, Laura couldn't stop thinking about Emily. The little girl was staying with a social worker for the time being, but Laura knew she needed more than just a safe place to sleep. She needed closure. She needed to know that her mother's death wouldn't be in vain. Laura decided to visit Emily that evening. When she arrived at the social worker's house, Emily was sitting on the couch, her stuffed rabbit in her lap. She looked up as Laura walked in, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Did you catch him?" Emily asked quietly. Laura sat down beside her. "We did, Emily. He's in custody, and he's not going to hurt anyone ever again." Emily nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. "I miss her," she whispered. "I miss my mom." Laura's heart ached for the girl. "I know, sweetheart. And I promise you, we're going to make sure everyone who hurt her pays for what they did." Emily looked up at her, her eyes wide. "There are more people?" Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Your stepfather was part of something much bigger. But we're going to find out who they are and stop them, and we're going to do it for your mom." Emily wiped her tears and nodded, her small face filled with determination. "I want to help." Laura smiled gently. "You already have, Emily. You've been so brave. But right now the best thing you can do is stay safe and let us handle the rest." As Laura left the house, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Emily's courage had brought them this far, and she wasn't going to let the little girl down. Back at the station, the team had made progress. They had traced some of the offshore accounts to a shell company based in another country, and the coded messages were starting to make sense. It appeared that Sarah had been gathering evidence against the people involved, and that was why she had been killed. "She was trying to expose them," Mark said, holding up a decoded message. "She knew what they were doing, and she was going to take them down." Laura's respect for Sarah grew. She had been a brave woman, willing to risk everything to do the right thing, and now it was up to Laura and her team to finish what Sarah had started. But as they dug deeper, the danger became more apparent. One of the names on the list was a high-ranking official in the city government, and another was a well-known businessman with ties to the criminal underworld. These were not people who would go down without a fight. "We need to be careful," Laura warned her team. "If they find out we're onto them, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us." The team worked late into the night, piecing together the puzzle. By morning, they had a plan. They would start by bringing in the city official for questioning, using the evidence they had to pressure him into talking. If they could get him to flip, they might be able to take down the entire network. But as Laura prepared for the interrogation, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. These people were powerful, and they had resources far beyond what the police could match. If they weren't careful, they could end up just like Sarah. As she walked into the interrogation room, Laura took a deep breath. The stakes had never been higher, but she was determined to see this through. For Sarah, for Emily, and for justice. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. Detective Laura Hayes sat across from City Councilman Gregory Hargrove, a man whose name had appeared multiple times on the list Robert Carter had provided. Hargrove was calm and composed, his expensive suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. "Councilman Hargrove," Laura began, her voice steady but firm, "we have evidence linking you to illegal activities including money laundering and fraud. We also believe you were involved in the murder of Sarah Carter." Hargrove raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild amusement. "That's quite an accusation, Detective. Do you have proof?" Laura slid a folder across the table containing copies of the documents they had recovered. "We have bank records, coded messages, and testimony from Robert Carter. He's already in custody, and he's cooperating with our investigation." Hargrove glanced at the documents but didn't open the folder. "Robert Carter is a desperate man," he said smoothly. "He'll say anything to save himself. You can't seriously believe his word over mine." Laura leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "We don't just have his word, we have Sarah's. She was gathering evidence against you and your associates. She knew what you were doing, and she was going to expose you. That's why she was killed." For the first time, Hargrove's composure wavered. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. "I had nothing to do with Sarah Carter's death." "Then explain this," Laura said, pulling out a photograph from the folder. It showed Hargrove meeting with Robert Carter and another man, whose face was partially obscured. The photo had been taken by Sarah, one of the many pieces of evidence she had risked her life to collect. Hargrove stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. "This proves nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It proves you were involved," Laura countered. "And if you don't start talking, you're going to take the fall for everything. But if you cooperate, we might be able to work out a deal." Hargrove hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. Finally, he let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. "Fine," he said. "I'll talk, but I want immunity." Laura shook her head. "Immunity's not on the table, but if you help us bring down the others, we'll make sure the judge knows you cooperated." Hargrove's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked like a man defeated. "What do you want to know?" Over the next several hours, Hargrove revealed the extent of the conspiracy. It was a vast network of corruption, involving high-ranking officials, businessmen, and even members of law enforcement. Sarah had stumbled onto their operation while investigating a seemingly unrelated case, and she had been gathering evidence to expose them. When they realized what she was doing, they had ordered her death. As Laura listened, her anger grew. These people had destroyed lives, all for the sake of money and power. But now, thanks to Sarah's bravery and Emily's courage, they were finally going to face justice. The investigation made headlines across the country. One by one, the members of the conspiracy were arrested and charged. The public was outraged, and the case became a symbol of the fight against corruption. Sarah Carter was posthumously honored for her bravery, and her story inspired others to stand up against injustice. For Emily, the road to healing was long and difficult. She was placed in the care of a loving foster family who helped her navigate the trauma she had endured. Laura stayed in touch, visiting her regularly and offering support whenever she could. One evening, as they sat together in the park, Emily looked up at Laura and smiled. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" she asked. Laura's heart swelled with emotion. "Emily, your mom would be so proud of you. You were so brave, and because of you, a lot of bad people are going to pay for what they did." Emily nodded, her smile widening. "I miss her," she said softly. "But I think she's watching over me." Laura put an arm around the girl's shoulders. "I think so too, and she'll always be with you no matter what." As they sat there, watching the sun set over the horizon, Laura felt a sense of peace. The case had been one of the most challenging of her career, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. Justice had been served, and a little girl had been given a chance at a better future. The story of Sarah Carter and her daughter Emily was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage and determination could shine a light. And as long as there were people willing to fight for the truth, justice would always prevail.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.